everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And of course, don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week, we are going to be talking about a solved case from the southwest of England when a young woman just mysteriously disappeared from her home shortly before Christmas. A huge police search ensued to try and find her, but tragically, over a week later, this case went from being a missing persons investigation to a murder inquiry when a horrific discovery was made underneath a pile of snow on the side of a road. Before her body had even been found, the police already identified a top suspect in the case, and when the media got wind of who this suspect was, they hounded him relentlessly. He was practically convicted of this crime by the British press before he'd even been so much as arrested by the police. And as it would turn out, he was completely innocent. He was innocent whilst the real killer remained at large, just lurking in the shadows, doing everything that he could to get away with what he had done. Join me as we delve into the tragic case of Joanna Yates. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to MD Hair for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Now, I am so excited to be working with MD Hair because their shampoo and conditioner and other hair care products are the exact kind of products that I've been needing in my hair care routine for a long time. MD Hair is the world's first medical grade hair growth treatment customized to the exact cause and type of hair loss. Last year, I was actually diagnosed with PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, and one of the main symptoms that I unfortunately experience as a result of having PCOS is hair loss. Growing up, I used to always have the thickest, longest hair, and whilst my hair is still very, very long, it has sadly thinned out a lot. My hair sheds a lot more than it used to the point where I would brush my hair and it would literally come out in clumps almost, and it used to really get me down, I'm not gonna lie. So I'm so happy to have started my hair regrowth journey with MD Hair. Their treatments are clinically proven, they're developed by dermatologists, they're made with natural ingredients, and all of their products are cruelty-free, sulfate-free, paraben-free, phthalate-free, and packed in recyclable packaging. And like I said, they are customizable. All you have to do is fill out a super quick online quiz about your hair type and your hair goals. You can also take a picture of your scalp for them, and then the team at MD Hair will get to work and they'll use this information and also AI technology on the scalp picture to create a treatment kit specifically designed for you and your hair needs. They'll send you shampoo, conditioner, hair serum, and even some customized supplements and marine collagen as well. And although I'm just starting my hair regrowth journey with MD Hair, I can say that I am already noticing a difference in how my hair feels. I feel like it has more volume, it doesn't feel as dry, I feel like the texture has improved. So I can't wait to continue using it and to see how much more it improves over time. And a massive bonus, of course, it also smells really great too. Their shampoo and conditioners just smell incredible. Kind of like lavender, which is definitely one of my favourite scents. So if you would like to treat yourself and start your hair regrowth journey, then listen up because MD Hair are very kindly offering my viewers an amazing discount. If you click the link in the description box and use the code Mollie70, you will be able to receive 70% off of your first month of customized products. Once again, that's code Mollie70 for 70% off. Thank you so much once again to MD Hair for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you so much to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as sexual assault and child pornography. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back just under a decade and a half now to late 2010 in Clifton, which is an inner suburb located in the city of Bristol in the southwest of England. And this is Joanna Yates. She was a 25-year-old woman who lived in Bristol, although she was originally from Hampshire actually. She was from a village called Ampfield in Hampshire, and she was born on the 19th of April 1985 to her parents David and Teresa Yates. Jo was one of two children, I believe. She had an older brother named Chris who was just a couple of years older than her, and as far as I'm aware, she had a very normal, happy upbringing. She seemed to have a very very privileged childhood, really. Her parents were able to send her to private school, and after getting her A-levels, Joanna became a student at the Writtle University College in Essex, where she graduated with a degree in landscape architecture, later earning her postgraduate diploma in the subject from the University of Gloucestershire. That was what Joanna wanted to do with her life. She wanted a career in landscape architecture, and she eventually got a job in Bristol doing just that. She worked for an architect and engineers firm called Building Design Partnership, and so she relocated there. But Jo didn't move to Bristol alone. She actually moved with her partner. She was dating a man named Greg Reardon, who was 27 years old. The two met in December of 2008. They hit it off, started dating, and they decided to move to Clifton in Bristol together in October of 2010. They decided to move to the city to kind of progress both of their careers. They were a very career-driven couple, it seems, both very successful and hardworking. And yeah, they moved into a ground floor flat at 44 Canyon Road in Clifton just a couple of months before this case took place, and they began building a life together there. Joanna Yates was described by her loved ones as being just a very positive and happy young woman. She was buoyant and cheerful, with her father David describing her as being, quote, a breath of fresh air. I also have another quote here from the partner of Jo's brother Chris. She described Jo as being, quote, a perfect beacon of light and a great example of all of us to live every day to our fullest potential. Just something that I came across constantly during my research of this case was how positive Joanna was. That was something that she was just clearly known for, her positivity. She was clearly a very upbeat, glass half full kind of person, and yeah, by 25 years old, as I said, she really was building a life for herself with her partner Greg in Bristol. They were settled, they were working on their careers, and they just seemed so happy and content. Jo seemed so content. It was nearing the end of 2010, Christmas was coming up, and Jo was looking forward to it. I believe I read on one source that this was the first Christmas that she and Greg would be spending together, so yeah, she was so excited. However, as it would turn out, it was a Christmas that Joanna Yates would never get to see, as just over a week before the big day, she mysteriously disappeared one cold December night. The date was the 17th of December 2010. It was a Friday, and that Friday evening, Joanna Yates had decided that she was going to go out with some of her co-workers for a couple of drinks. You know, it was the end of the working week, they'd all been working hard, it was the festive season, and so they decided to go out together and relax, and they headed to a pub called the Bristol Ram pub, which was located on Park Street in Bristol. Joanna was caught on CCTV in this pub with her friends and colleagues, and she seemed to be having a really good time, and then around 8 p.m. that night, she left the pub to go back home. Well, she didn't head home straight away. She actually went to a couple of shops before. She was walking through Bristol city centre, and she went into a Waitrose supermarket, although she didn't end up buying anything in there. She just had a bit of a browse. Following this, she went into an off-licence called Bargain Booze, where she purchased 2 bottles of cider, and then from here she went to a Tesco supermarket where she was captured on CCTV buying a pizza for herself, and then after leaving Tesco she headed back home. She walked back to her flat on Canyon Road at approximately 8:50 p.m, where she would be spending the rest of the evening, and in fact the rest of that weekend alone. You see, her partner Greg was away for the weekend. Apparently he had gone to see some relatives of his in Sheffield, and so it was just going to be Jo in the flat for a few days. It was her first weekend in the flat by herself, actually, which apparently she told her colleagues at the pub she was not looking forward to being alone. But you know, she planned to keep herself busy. According to reports, she planned to do a bit of Christmas baking and Christmas shopping, and then Greg was due to return home on the Sunday, which was the 19th of December, and he obviously expected his girlfriend Joanna to be there to greet him when he got back. But surprisingly, she wasn't. When the 19th rolled around and Greg arrived back at the flat that he and Jo shared at around 8 p.m. that evening, there was no sign of Jo. It seemed as though she had gone out somewhere, although actually, as Greg looked around the flat, he noticed some things that made him think that that wasn't in fact the case. You see, Jo's purse and her keys were just left in the flat, which seemed incredibly bizarre. If Jo had gone somewhere, surely she would have taken those 2 things. Greg also noticed that her coat was was still in the flat, and again he thought surely she would have taken that because it was December, it was freezing outside, temperatures were extremely low, and yet wherever Jo had gone she hadn't taken her coat. But probably the most confusing thing, Jo hadn't taken her mobile phone with her either. So when Greg arrived back at the flat and he realised that Jo wasn't there, of course one of the first things he did was call her mobile. However, as he did so, he could hear it ringing somewhere in the flat. It turns out that it was in her coat pocket. And why would Jo have done that? Why would she have left the house without her keys, purse and phone? Those are probably the three most important things that we all make sure we have when we leave our homes, don't we? And yet for some reason Jo just left them behind. In addition to that, it seemed as though she hadn't fed the cat. Greg and Jo had a cat, and Greg could tell that the cat hadn't been fed recently, probably in days. And in fact, Greg had been trying to reach Jo for days. Whilst he had been away in Sheffield, he'd been calling and texting her, but she just hadn't responded to him. He hadn't actually heard from her since 2 days before, on the 17th, the Friday evening that she went out for drinks with her colleagues. So something just seemed very, very wrong here. This was so unusual, so out of character for Jo to just go seemingly off the radar. So shortly after returning to the flat, Greg called Joanna's family. He called her parents, David and Teresa, asking if perhaps she was with them or if they had heard from her, but they said no, they had no idea where she was. And so, extremely worried, Greg decided that he needed to contact the police and report his girlfriend Joanna Yates as missing. This was in the early hours of the morning on the 20th of December 2010. So a missing persons inquiry was launched and the search for Joanna Yates quickly began. And of course, one of the first places the police searched was Joanna and Greg's flat for anything that could indicate where Joanna might have gone. And to be honest, there was absolutely nothing about the flat that was particularly alarming, I suppose, for the police, in the sense that there was no evidence or indication that anything bad had happened there. There didn't seem to be any evidence of foul play. The flat looked relatively normal. There were no signs of forced entry, so it didn't look like there had been a break-in. Nothing had been like smashed or knocked over, so there were no signs of a violent struggle. The home didn't appear to have been ransacked, so it didn't look like a burglary had occurred. Nothing appeared to be missing. Well, nothing except, it seemed, a pizza. If you recall, on the evening of the 17th, the evening that Jo was last seen, after she left her friends at the pub, she walked to a few shops where she bought 2 bottles of cider and a pizza. Now, the 2 bottles of cider were found in her flat. I think they were just on the side in the kitchen. One of them was open, and it was clear that someone, most likely Jo, had taken like a sip out of it. However, the pizza that she bought wasn't found anywhere in the flat. Now, you may be thinking, well, yeah, she probably ate it when she got home that evening, which of course would make sense. Apart from the fact that absolutely nothing relating to the pizza was found in the flat. So what I mean by that is the packaging. The box that the pizza came in was gone. It had vanished. It wasn't found in her bin or in the bins outside. It was just gone. I mean, it was through the bottles of cider and a receipt from her trip to Tesco being in the home that the police were able to establish that Joanna had made it back to the flat that night. It wasn't like she disappeared while she was walking home. They were able to prove that she did make it back. But then where on earth did this pizza go, or the pizza box? The police started to think that if foul play was involved in Jo's disappearance, if she had been abducted or perhaps murdered, did the perpetrator take this pizza? And they were pretty certain that she had vanished on that Friday evening, the evening of the 17th, because that was the last time she was seen or heard from. I think the last time her phone was used. And the police also noticed that the advent calendar in the flat hadn't been opened since the 16th of December. The 17th and 18th hadn't been opened. So yeah, they were sure that something had happened to Jo on the evening of the 17th, probably very shortly after she she returned home to her flat. Of course, as well as searching the flat for evidence, the police also conducted searches for Joanna around Clifton, around Bristol. They were taking statements from her friends and family, and actually just the day after she was reported as missing, on the 21st of December, her heartbroken parents, David and Teresa, made a public appeal alongside Joanna's boyfriend Greg, urging anyone with any information regarding their daughter's whereabouts to come forward. And the family did many appeals over the coming days, televised appeals, just trying to get their daughter's name and face in the media as much as they could, because obviously the more people knew about her case, the better chance they had of finding her. And I mean, it worked very quickly. News of Joanna Yates's disappearance spread like wildfire. It became national news, actually. Everyone in the country knew about her disappearance. I vividly remember seeing Jo's face on the news and in the newspapers everywhere at the time, and I was only like 11 years old. The police did look into the people in Jo's life, the men, extensively, just in case she could have known the perpetrator if foul play was involved here. And as expected, one of the very first people they looked at was her partner Greg. He was looked at as a potential suspect, but he was quickly ruled out when police could prove that he was in fact in Sheffield at the time that she vanished. He was nowhere near Bristol, and also he had no reason to want to do anything to Jo. He loved her so much. They were so happy together. In fact, he described her as being his entire future. He saw himself growing old with Jo. That's how in love with her he was. He was devastated that she was missing. In addition to everything else, the police were conducting door-to-door inquiries, asking people who lived nearby if they'd seen or heard anything suspicious on the night in question. And actually, the police did receive some information from some members of the public who said that on the evening of the 17th of December 2010, they were actually attending a party at an address that was just across the road from Joanna and Greg's flat. And these party guests recalled how shortly after Jo would have arrived home at her flat that evening, they remembered hearing some loud screams in the area. Now, it doesn't seem like they really thought much of these screams at the time, because they didn't report it or call the police as far as I'm aware. Maybe they just thought that there was another party going on or something. But yeah, now they did think that perhaps that could have been Joanna. Maybe it was her screaming that night. Meanwhile, the outdoor searches for Joanna continued. As the days went by, the police were expanding the search for her across Clifton and Bristol. More police officers were added to the case. Friends and family were out searching. Volunteers offered to help, but despite everyone's best efforts, there was nothing really. Absolutely no sign of Jo anywhere. And the detectives were really struggling, to be honest, because as I said, there seemed to be nothing to go on. No evidence or clues which could point them in the direction of a lead, in the direction of where she might have gone or what had happened to her. They were really stuck. They had no idea whether Jo was still alive and out there somewhere, or whether something really sinister had happened to her and she was dead. And the pain and torment for her family just got worse and worse as the days passed by with no news, no developments. They just had no answers, or at least that was until the 25th of December 2010, Christmas Day, when the police received a report of a terrible discovery that had been made in an area just over 3 miles away from where Joanna lived and vanished from. On the morning of the 25th of December, a couple were out walking their dogs near a quarry along a country road called Longwood Lane in Fayland in Bristol. And as they were walking, they noticed something buried in the snow on the roadside. There had been a lot of snowfall at this time in England, and they spotted what looked like some clothing almost sticking out of this pile of snow. And immediately they just had a gut feeling that something felt weird about this clothing. I mean, they'd probably heard on the news that a young woman was missing. Police had been searching for her for 8 days by this point, and now they'd made this discovery on the roadside, and so they decided to just call the police straight away. And when police arrived at the scene, they were able to confirm this couple's fears. This clothing buried in the snow was in fact a dead human body, a fully clothed woman's body, later of course confirmed to have been the body of missing 25-year-old Joanna Yates. Finally, after more than a week of searching, wishing Joanna had been found, but tragically the news that she'd been found dead was something that no one wanted to hear. And on Christmas Day of all days, I mean, it's awful for this discovery to have been made on any day of the year, but on Christmas Day especially, I can only imagine that it must have just completely ruined this magical time of year for Joanna's loved ones forever now, because it will always mark and represent the day that she was discovered dead on the side of the road. So as I said, Joanna's body was found fully clothed. She was on a grass verge on the side of the road, and it was established that she had most likely been there since the day that she went missing. But to be honest, she was very well hidden because of the snow. As I mentioned, there had actually been a lot of snowfall across the southwest in the week that Jo was missing. So although she was just on the side of the road, any cars that had driven past wouldn't have been really able to see her because, yeah, she was covered with snow. In addition to that, it's a rather remote area of Bristol. Like I said, it's a country lane, so not like a main road or anything. It's not that well lit, so it does make sense why it took, I guess, so long for her to be found. And in addition to the snow covering her, it seemed as though she'd also been covered with like leaves and tree branches and grass in a deliberate attempt to hide her. Joanna was found still wearing the same clothes that she had on the evening that she went missing, apart from her coat, which was obviously found hung up in her flat. But also one of her socks was missing. She'd been wearing these thick grey ski socks because it had been so cold outside, and whilst one of these socks was still on one of her feet, the other was gone. It wasn't found on the other foot, and the police didn't find it anywhere in her flat. So had the killer taken that away with them for some reason, perhaps as a trophy? Of course, it was confirmed that this was a murder. Joanna had been murdered, and during her post-mortem it was concluded that her cause of death was strangulation. However, she also had 43 other separate injuries to her body, as well as injuries to her neck. She also had injuries to her head, torso and arms. She sustained cuts and bruises, clearly from where there had been a violent struggle between her and her attacker. There didn't seem to be any signs that Jo had been sexually assaulted by her attacker, but obviously that doesn't necessarily rule out a sexual motive here. It's definitely still possible that this crime was sexually motivated. Perhaps the perpetrator intended to sexually assault her, but for whatever reason they didn't get round to it in the end. And despite the fact that she'd clearly died a good 8 days earlier, her body was actually not very decomposed at all by the time she was found because of the snow. The icy temperatures and the fact that she was buried in snow meant that her body was quite well preserved, I guess. Her body was frozen, actually. When Jo was found, she was lying in the fetal position, which was not a natural position, so it was clear to the police that she had been placed there. And actually, another discovery that the police made at the scene was some blood on this wall near to Joanna's body. So basically, just to kind of set the scene for you, like I said, Joanna's body was found on this grass verge on the side of the road on Longwood Lane, and behind her on this verge was a wall. Now over this wall was another verge which kind of led down to the entrance of a local quarry, and what the blood on the wall indicated was that initially the killer had tried to lift Joanna's body over the wall so that she was on the other side, the quarry side, which was obviously more hidden from the road, but they failed. They couldn't lift her over this wall. It was also clear that she had been killed elsewhere and then brought to the roadside, possibly killed in her flat. She wasn't murdered on Longwood Lane, and the police could tell this because the one foot of hers that was bare, that was missing the grey sock, was clean. So it was clear that she'd been carried to this location and then dumped. It wasn't like she'd walked barefoot. Well, she'd obviously been driven to this location and then her body was carried out of a vehicle and placed on the roadside. And again, it was confirmed that she'd been carried by the killer when her clothing was examined, because scientists found what they believed was the DNA of the offender on Joanna's jeans, where it's thought that the killer picked her up and kind of held her, carried her like this. Unknown male DNA was also found, I believe, around the zip area of her jeans, around the fly area, perhaps suggesting that there was in fact a sexual motive here. I don't know, the fact that DNA was found on the fly area of her jeans, had the offender tried to unzip her jeans with the intention of assaulting her? And in addition to that, fact, when swabs were taken from her body, this same unknown male DNA profile was found on areas of her body where her skin was bare, again thought to be from where the killer had carried her. So now that Joanna's body had been found, this case had obviously gone from being a missing persons investigation to a murder inquiry. The inquiry was given the name Operation Braid, and Operation Braid would become one of the biggest investigations that the Avon and Somerset police had ever had to deal with. They had about 70 to 80 detectives assigned to the case. They continued to appeal to the public, and a £10,000 reward for information was offered by Crime Stoppers for anyone who had any information which could lead to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for Joanna's murder. However, whilst the police were following up on the tips and leads that they had received from the public, they also looked very, very closely at one particular person as possibly being the killer. In fact, I believe before Joanna's body was even found, they'd already kind of identified a potential top suspect in the investigation. It was a man named Christopher Jefferies. Now, Christopher Jefferies was around 65 years old at the time that this case occurred. He was a former English teacher, but he was retired by this point, and he was a landlord. In fact, he was Joanna's landlord. Christopher Jefferies was the owner of the building, the house that Joanna lived in with her partner Greg. As I understand it, the house was split into 3 separate flats, which Jefferies rented out. Well, he rented out 2 of them. Joanna and Greg lived in one, another couple lived in the other, and then Christopher Jefferies himself lived in the 3rd flat. He lived in the flat above Joe and Greg. And those that knew Christopher would describe him as being a rather quiet and intelligent man, but he was also said to be quite eccentric and, quote, peculiar in some ways. I don't know, people just thought that the way that he spoke and the way he kind of carried himself was a bit strange. Not necessarily in a bad way, I don't think, just different. Now, of course, because Christopher Jefferies was Joe's landlord and because he lived in the same building as her, he was one of the first people that the police spoke to when she went missing. The police wanted to take a full statement from him and find out what he had been doing on the night that Joe disappeared and, as we know now, was killed the night of the 17th of December 2010. Now, his account was that that evening he'd been to the gym exercising, and then after leaving the gym he returned home to his flat on Canyon Road at approximately 9 p.m. So around the same time that police believed Joanna had returned home that night. If you recall, they estimated that she had gotten back to her flat sometime around 8:50. So yeah, he arrived back at around 9 p.m. He went into his flat and that was it, really. He was in for the night. He didn't really see or hear anything suspicious. It just seemed like a normal evening. Now, of course, this wasn't the best alibi for the police because Christopher Jefferies did live alone in his flat, so there was no one that could confirm that he did in fact stay inside of his flat for the rest of the evening after returning from the gym. But the reason why police became quite suspicious of Jefferies was because he would actually go on to change his story. So again, just to reiterate, in the first statement that he gave, he said that he just came home from the gym at around 9 and he went straight up to his flat and he was in for the night. And that was all that he really said in his first statement. But then later, when he gave a second statement, he kind of added to his story. He said that he suddenly remembered that when he returned home from the gym, as he was walking up his driveway, he recalled having possibly seen either one or a couple of people walking up the pathway to the side of the house away from the property. He didn't really fully register them at the time, but yeah, by the time he was giving his second statement, he had this recollection of seeing these people. So he thought that he better tell the police in case it could have been relevant to Joanna's case. Christopher Jefferies thought that he was just being helpful by telling the police this extra information, but understandably for the detectives, it was a little bit suspicious that he'd added to his initial account. They wondered if he was being truthful. Did he really see these people in the pathway that night, or was he lying? Was he trying to divert the police's attention and make them think that these people he saw were the ones responsible for Joanna's disappearance and murder, when in fact he was the one responsible? Another factor that added to the police's suspicion was that they learned from Joe's partner partner Greg that earlier in the day, on the same day that Joe vanished, the 17th of December, Christopher Jefferies had actually assisted Greg with jump-starting his car. Obviously, Greg was headed to Sheffield that day to spend the weekend with relatives, leaving Joe in the flat on her own. However, I think when he went to leave, he realised that his car wouldn't start. And so Christopher Jefferies got his jump leads out and he helped Greg jumpstart his car. And I think it was during this when Greg informed him that he was headed to Sheffield for a few days to see family before Christmas. So Christopher Jefferies would have known that Greg wasn't going to be in the flat for the weekend. So they began theorising that perhaps Jefferies saw this as his opportunity to attack Joe because he knew that she would be home alone. So yeah, this accompanied with the changing statement and the fact that he didn't have a strong alibi really did make Christopher Jefferies practically the top suspect for investigators. They began looking at him very, very closely, and the media soon got wind of this. Now, of course, the police didn't announce to the media and the public that they were looking at Joanna's landlord, Christopher Jefferies, as a person of interest, but the UK press are relentless and they have ways of finding that information out for themselves. We obviously know that Joanna's case had reached national news. It had a lot of media and public interest, and so when the press discovered that Jefferies was a suspect, instead of just letting the police get on with their jobs, they began literally hounding Christopher Jefferies. They would confront him on the streets, they would shove cameras in his face and ask him questions about the Joanna Yates investigation, and he would pretty much refuse to comment, saying that he didn't want to speak to the media, but still they just harassed him all the time, to the point where he practically became a prisoner in his own home. He felt like he couldn't leave his house, or else he would be followed and harassed by journalists.
Are you able to give us any detail of what it was you told them?
I'm afraid not, no. I'm not prepared to make any comments to the media.
So you didn't see her that evening?
I certainly cannot say that I saw Joanna Yates that evening, no.
Thank you very much.
The press treated him horrifically. Honestly, it was like a trial by the tabloids. They started printing awful things about him in the newspapers, printing lies about him, saying that he was a peeping Tom when he wasn't, that he used to freak out schoolgirls when he worked as an English teacher. The tabloids would call him strange and a creep. They labelled him as a pervert and a predator. It was just appalling, really. It was almost like the press had just decided that he was responsible for this murder when he hadn't even been charged with anything in relation to Joe's case. There was no innocent until proven guilty here, not for the media. And then 5 days after Joanna's body was found, the news broke that Christopher Jefferies had been arrested. On the 30th of December 2010, police arrested him on suspicion of her murder. He was immediately taken to the police station where he was interviewed and interrogated a number of times by the detectives. However, he never admitted to anything. He was adamant that he was innocent. He had nothing to do with Joanna's death whatsoever. But the police were not convinced, and so they began searching for concrete evidence which linked Jefferies to the crime, because, I mean, really, the only evidence they had so far was circumstantial, if that. But it was soon after his arrest when this circumstantial evidence started to build. You see, the police were contacted by a neighbour of Joanna's after Jefferies was taken into custody. So if you recall, I mentioned before that the house that Joanna and Greg lived in was split into 3 separate flats. One of them was occupied by Joanna and Greg, the other by the landlord Christopher Jefferies, and then the third flat, which was adjoining Greg and Joanna's, was occupied by another couple, a man named Vincent Tabak and his girlfriend Tanya. And when Christopher Jefferies was arrested, Vincent Tabak got in touch with the police as he suddenly remembered something that he saw on the night that Joanna vanished and was killed that he thought might have been of interest to them. So Vincent said that he had been in his flat on the night of the 17th and he remembered seeing Christopher Jefferies' car parked on the driveway after Jefferies would have returned home from the gym around 9 p.m. However, Vincent Tabak then said that later that night, actually in the early hours of the following morning, he was leaving his flat to go and pick up his girlfriend Tanya from this Christmas party that she was attending, and he remembered noticing that Christopher Jefferies' car was still on the driveway, but oddly it was now facing the opposite direction. So when Vincent saw it the first time that night, it was faced one way, and then by the early hours of the morning it was faced the other way, as if Jefferies had gone out in his car that night, which of course doesn't fit his alibi. Jefferies said that after getting home from the gym, he stayed in his flat on his own for the rest of the night. But now, this statement from Vincent Tabak was indicating otherwise. In addition to that, upon searching Christopher Jefferies' flat, forensic teams found a pair of trainers which appeared to have what looked like a little speck of blood on them. So thinking that this blood may have been Joanna's, they were immediately sent to the lab to be examined. And I believe it was this discovery in particular that enabled the police to hold him in custody for longer. Obviously, in England, the police can detain you for up to 24 hours before they either charge you or release you. However, they can apply to the magistrate's court for permission to extend this if they feel that they need more time to question their suspect and collect evidence. And so that's exactly what they did in this case, and they were granted permission to hold Jefferies in custody for longer whilst they continued building their case against him. However, as it would turn out, the case didn't build. In fact, it did the opposite. Their case against Christopher Jefferies started to crumble. Of course, a major part of their investigation was DNA. They wanted to see if they could link Jefferies to Joanna's murder using DNA, because obviously that would be rock solid proof that he was the one who killed her. However, they didn't find any. No DNA or forensic link whatsoever. None of Jefferies' DNA was found on Joe's clothing, the clothing that she was wearing when she was killed and her body was found. They searched his car for any fibres relating to Joe. Obviously, we know that her body had been transported to Longwood Lane where she was found. So if she had been in his car, you would have expected perhaps some fibres from her clothing to be found in there, but nothing. There was none. Going back to those trainers of Jefferies that were seized from his flat, the trainers that looked to have a tiny speck of blood on them, well, unfortunately, the tests conducted on that blood stain were unsuccessful. The blood came back as, quote, insufficient quality, meaning that scientists couldn't extract a DNA profile from it, so they were never able to confirm whose blood it was. But I mean, it could have been anyone's, couldn't it? It could have been Christopher's own blood on his shoes, so yeah, that was a dead end. But the piece of evidence that made the police's case against Jefferies just collapse the most, his DNA was not a match to the male DNA profile that was recovered from Joanna's body, from where the killer had carried her out of the car and onto the grass verge. It wasn't Jefferies' DNA. So despite the police's suspicions, despite being interrogated relentlessly by detectives for days, despite the intense media scrutiny that Jefferies was subjected to, he was an innocent man. He was telling the truth. He really had nothing to do with what had happened to Joanna. And so on the 1st of January 2011, New Year's Day, Christopher Jefferies was released from custody without charge. So I mean, now detectives were effectively back to square one. If Jefferies wasn't the killer, then who on earth was? Although in fairness, they weren't back to square one for very long. Very rapidly, the police were able to identify another prime suspect in the investigation, because although Jefferies' DNA didn't match the samples taken from Joe's body, somebody else's did. Scientists had identified a match, and guess who it was to? Vincent Tabak. Vincent Tabak, that neighbour who contacted the police after Christopher Jefferies was arrested and told them that story about how he noticed that Jefferies' car had moved and changed direction on the night that Joe died, thus implicating Jefferies as being the murderer, which of course we now know that he wasn't. So it seemed as though Vincent Tabak had lied to the police. In fact, just to delve further into that a second, so when Tabak called the police with this story about Christopher Jefferies' car, he was actually in the Netherlands, in Holland, which is where his family lived, where he was originally from. He'd obviously gone to see his relatives over the festive period. He travelled there on the 30th of December 2010 with his girlfriend Tanya. So yeah, he rang the police whilst he was in the Netherlands, and as this seemed like such a significant piece of information against Jefferies in their investigation, the Avon and Somerset police actually decided to have a couple of officers travel to Holland to speak with him in person and take a full statement from him. This was on the 31st of December 2010. However, when they did this, when they spoke to Vincent Tabak in person, they actually just got a really weird feeling about him. I don't know, the way that he was acting just seemed a bit odd. The way that he was responding to questions was just very strange. So apparently one minute he would be very vague in his answers, and then the next he would provide loads and loads of detail. According to reports, he was also very interested to know from the officers what kind of forensic evidence they had in Joanna's case, you know, whether they had DNA or fingerprints, etc, etc. But the most suspicious thing of all about this meeting with Vincent Tabak was the fact that he was very reluctant to give his DNA sample. Obviously, the main reason that the police had travelled to Holland was to take this statement from him about Christopher Jefferies' car, because by this point, Jefferies was still in custody and still the top suspect in the case. But you know, Vincent Tabak was also Joanna's neighbour, so the police asked him if he wouldn't mind giving a voluntary DNA sample. And he seemed very hesitant when they asked him this. It was clear that he didn't want to give his samples, but ultimately he did end up agreeing. He said, yeah, okay. And like I said, when his DNA was compared against the DNA recovered from Joanna's body, what do you know? It was a match. I mean, it wasn't the strongest match, don't get me wrong. You see, this DNA from Joanna's body was actually quite a weak profile due to her being outside and having been exposed to the elements for more than a week after she died. So the killer's DNA retrieved from her body was described as being a, quote, low-level DNA profile, but nevertheless, it seemed to match Vincent Tabak. This man had unknowingly put himself in the frame for Joanna's murder. It was clear now that him calling the police and giving that false statement about Christopher Jefferies' car having changed direction was his attempt at placing the blame on Jefferies. He was trying to trick the police and make them think that Jefferies was the perpetrator, when in fact now the evidence indicated that he was. But who even was Vincent Tabak? Before we continue with the investigation, let's delve a little bit more into his background. So Vincent Tabak was born on the 10th of February 1978, meaning that he was around 32 years old at the time that this case occurred. As I previously mentioned, he was originally from the Netherlands. He was one of 5 children, of which he was the youngest, and as a child he was kind of known to be quite quiet and shy, a bit of a loner, definitely more of an introverted type rather than an extrovert. But equally, he was also a very smart kid. He grew up to be an incredibly intelligent and academic young man. In 2003, he graduated from the Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands with a master's degree in architecture, building and planning. Following on from this, he went on to earn his PhD, and in 2007, he relocated from the Netherlands to the UK, to Bath in the southwest of England, where he got a job working as a people flow analyst at an engineering consultancy firm. Whilst he was living in Bath for work, he met his girlfriend Tanya, and then in the summer of 2009, so about a year and a half before Joanna Yates was killed, Vincent and Tanya moved to Bristol together. They started renting their flat off of Christopher Jefferies on Canyon Road in Clifton. To an outsider's perspective, Vincent Tabak just seemed like a nice, normal man. As I said, he was very intelligent. Although he was quite quiet, he always seemed quite friendly. He didn't have any kind of criminal record. There was nothing about him that would have made alarm bells ring for the police, hence why he didn't jump out at them as an immediate suspect in the case right in the very beginning. I mean, to be honest, it kind of seemed like they were way too focused on Christopher Jefferies to even glance in the direction of anyone else. But of course, by the new year of 2011, that had all changed. He was now the prime suspect following the DNA match. And so on the 20th of January 2011, 32-year-old 23-year-old Vincent Tabak was arrested on suspicion of the murder of Joanna Yates. He was taken to the police station where he was interviewed, and I believe initially he completely denied being the one who killed Joanna, and he stuck to the same story that he gave the police at the very beginning of this case when officers spoke to him soon after Jo went missing. That story was that he was just on his own in his flat that night as his partner Tanya was out attending a Christmas party, and then he left his flat in the early hours of the 18th of December to go and pick Tanya up. As I understand it, he later added to this story and claimed that he also went to an Asda supermarket at one point that evening, but that was it. That was his account. He was adamant that he was not responsible for this crime. However, as the police continued the search for evidence, they found even more, which proved that Vincent Tabak was a liar. After they identified him as a suspect, the police learned that Tabak drove a grey-coloured Renault Megane, and so with this in mind, they decided to check CCTV cameras and ANPR cameras along the routes that Joanna's killer could have taken to transport her body from her flat on Canyon Road to Longwood Lane where she was found. And when they did this, sure enough, they spotted his car. His vehicle was captured going in the direction to and from Longwood Lane on the night that Joanna Yates was killed. And of course that was very, very damning evidence, because his story was that he'd stayed in his flat all night apart from going to an Asda supermarket and going to pick up his girlfriend Tanya from a party. He never mentioned going anywhere near Longwood Lane. Following Tabak's arrest, his vehicle, his Renault Megane, was seized by the police and forensically examined to see what evidence could be found. As it would turn out, quite a lot was. So firstly, scientists discovered these tiny pink cotton fibres in the boot or the trunk of his vehicle, and when these fibres were looked at under a microscope, it was determined that they exactly matched the fibres from the pink top that Joanna was wearing on the night that she died. Speaking of fibres, a lot of other fibres were retrieved from Joanna's body, from her clothing when her body was discovered, and scientists were later able to determine that these fibres matched an IKEA bedding set that Vincent Tabak and his girlfriend Tanya owned, suggesting perhaps that at one point he'd wrapped Joanna's body in this bedding. Apparently fibres from one of the bedding sets that Joanna and Greg owned were also found in the boot of Tabak's car. Fibres from Vincent Tabak's coat were recovered from Joanna's body, and a single pink cotton fibre found on this coat again matched the pink top that she was wearing. But possibly the most damning piece of evidence of all: blood. Whilst examining his car, the forensic team also found traces of blood in the boot. Despite the fact that he had clearly tried to clean his car recently, he'd clearly tried to clean the boot to get rid of any evidence, but he didn't clean well enough. When this blood was tested, it was found to be a match to that of the victim. Joanna Yates's blood was found in the boot of Vincent Tabak's car. But once again, the evidence did not stop there. As well as seizing his car and items of clothing, following his arrest, the police also seized Vincent Tabak's electronic devices like his phone and his computer, laptop, etc. And it was after looking through these devices that the police clearly identified the motive behind this horrific homicide. You see, on his laptop, the police found that Vincent Tabak would regularly watch very, very violent and aggressive pornography. In fact, it became clear that his favourite kind of pornography to watch was of women who were being strangled during sex. And if you remember, Joanna Yates's cause of death was strangulation. So although Joanna herself hadn't been sexually assaulted, the search history on Vincent Tabak's laptop made it clear to the police that this crime was still sexually motivated. In fact, the police also discovered through looking at his search history that after Jo went missing, Tabak would Google the case often. He would Google things like Jo, Bristol, forensics, because he obviously wanted to keep up to date with the case, try and work out whether the police were close to catching him. And what's incredibly disturbing is that it was found that when he would Google Jo's case, afterwards he would then view his pornography. He would watch videos of women being strangled during sex, which, I mean, told the police a hell of a lot. It was hugely significant because it showed that you know, he was almost getting turned on reading about Joe's case, to the point where immediately afterwards he would have to watch porn of women being choked. It was clear that in a way, almost reliving what he did to Joe through reading the newspaper articles about her disappearance made him sexually aroused. Other incriminating internet searches he'd made included the fact that he'd searched things like body decomposition times. He wanted Google to tell him how long a body takes to decompose, and it was also discovered that just 2 days after Joe disappeared and was killed, and 6 days before her body was found, he'd looked up Longwood Lane, where she was later found, on Google Maps, and he'd zoomed right in using the Street View feature to see the exact spot on Longwood Lane where her body was dumped. I mean, it was a lot. The evidence against Vincent Tabak was now overwhelming. There was no doubt in the detectives' minds that he was the perpetrator, and so just 4 days after he was arrested on the 24th of January 2011, he was charged with murder. And despite previously denying all involvement, when it came to his plea hearing in May of 2011, Vincent Tabak pleaded guilty, but not to murder. Vincent Tabak was now admitting that yes, he was the one responsible for Joanna Yates's death, but he said that he didn't mean to kill her. This wasn't a cold-blooded murder, it was an accident, and so he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Joanna Yates, but denied murder. His trial began in October of 2011, and unfortunately it was decided by the judge that the evidence of Tabak's violent pornography viewing would be deemed inadmissible in court. The prosecution were not allowed to bring that up as part of their case against him because it wasn't actually illegal pornography, and in the judge's opinion it did not prove that Vincent Tabak acted with premeditation. So yeah, they weren't allowed to mention the pornographic material that Tabak would watch, but I mean, regardless, the prosecution's case was still pretty rock solid even without it. As I mentioned, Tabak and his defense team were now saying that this was a case of manslaughter, not murder, and as part of their argument, Tabak gave a new version of events, and he actually talked the jury through this story himself. He testified as a witness during his trial. His new story is as follows. So Vincent Tabak said that on the night of the 17th of December 2010, he was obviously at his flat on his own because his girlfriend Tanya was at a Christmas party, and he claimed that when he walked past the window to Joanna's flat, he spotted Joanna and she spotted him, and she proceeded to beckon him inside. I think he claimed that she kind of gestured with her hand for him to come to her flat, and so he did. He went to Joanna's flat, she invited him in, even though they didn't know each other at all. Yes, they were neighbours, but I don't believe they'd ever actually properly met until this night. Anyway, he said that she invited him in, she offered him a drink, and Tabak claimed that at one point Joanna made some kind of, quote, flirty comment towards him, and he thought that she was trying to initiate something romantic, sexual between them, and so he went in to kiss Joanna. However, it quickly became clear that he'd read the situation wrong because she pulled away and immediately started screaming. And he said that when she started screaming, he just panicked. He put his hands over her mouth and then around her neck to stop her from screaming. And he said that he had her around the neck for probably about 20 seconds before realizing that she was dead. He'd accidentally killed her. He said that he didn't mean to kill her, and he denied having any kind of sexual motive to this attack. And that was his story. This was an accident. There was no intent to cause her death, which of course the prosecution did not believe for 1 minute. I mean, for starters, if it was an accident, why didn't he call for emergency services? Why didn't he call an ambulance to see if there was any chance that paramedics could have saved Joe? During the trial, he was trying to act as though he was really remorseful and that he felt so bad about what he did, but the fact that he hid her body on Longwood Lane and just let Joanna's family and friends friends go through 8 whole days of pain and torment because they didn't know where she was, what had happened to her. That to me is not a person who feels remorse. In addition to that, the prosecution also argued that the 43 other injuries to Joanna's body proved that this wasn't an accident. Tabak claimed in his account that when he grabbed Joanna around the neck, there was barely a struggle and she was dead within about 20 seconds. But then what about her other injuries? As we know, she had injuries to her torso area, her head, her arms. She had cuts and bruises. Apparently, according to one source, she even had a fractured nose. Those injuries suggest that there was a struggle between them in that flat, and a violent one at that. Joanna's death wasn't quick like he was trying to make out. In the prosecution's opinion, it was slow and painful. And at any point, Tabak could have stopped. He could have released his grip from Joanna's neck and she would have survived. But he didn't. It was the prosecution's case that Tabak entered Joanna's flat that night with the intention of harming her. We know that he had a fetish, I suppose, for seeing women being strangled. He went into her flat intending to cause her harm. This was a sexually motivated crime. How he knew that she was in the flat alone that night, I'm not sure. Perhaps he really did see her through the window after she returned home from the pub, and he realised that her partner Greg wasn't home, and so he decided to knock on her door and essentially force his way inside. The prosecution believed that Tabak used his height and his build to overpower Joanna. They theorized that he probably pinned her to the ground and that she was trying to fight him off. She was trying to defend herself, but he was able to put his hands around her neck and squeeze the life out of her. And it's believed that after Joanna was dead, Vincent Tabak actually took the pizza that she'd purchased from the Tesco supermarket earlier that night. That's why the pizza was missing and the police could find no trace of it or the box inside of Joanna's flat after she went missing. Tabak must have taken it and eaten it. Shortly after killing Joanna at 9:25 p.m, Vincent Tabak's phone showed that he texted his girlfriend Tanya saying that he was, quote, bored. It was boring being at home without her. Clearly that was him trying to, act as normal as possible, act as if he hadn't just committed murder. He bundled Joanna's body into the boot of his car and then he drove away from Canyon Road. Now, before he headed to Longwood Lane that night, it was found that he firstly went to an Asda supermarket and he was captured on CCTV in this supermarket. And the prosecution believed that he did this. He went to Asda because he was trying to give himself an alibi for around the time of Joe's disappearance and murder. But in fact, the police believed that whilst he was walking around Asda that evening giving himself the alibi, Joe's dead body was still in the boot of his car in the car park. And after leaving Asda, he headed to Longwood Lane in Fayland, and it was there when he ditched Joanna's body on the grass verge. As we know, as we discussed earlier, he initially tried to lift her up over the wall so that she wouldn't be on the same side as the road, but he was unsuccessful, and so he just left her on the grass verge. He attempted to cover her with leaves and grass, and then he left. He drove back home and later attempted to clean his car to get rid of any evidence. And we know that he kept a close eye on Joanna's case. He kept up to date with all of the developments because of his Google searches, and also we know that he tried to implicate his landlord Christopher Jefferies. He was probably elated when he read in the papers that Jefferies was the top suspect. Jefferies was going to take the fall for a crime that he had committed, and Tabak tried to ensure this by contacting the police and telling them that fake story about Jefferies having moved his car on the night that Joanna was killed. But like I said earlier, this had actually gone against him. He'd accidentally put himself in the frame by doing this because, of course, the police travelled out to the Netherlands to take that full statement from him, and they made note of his very, very suspicious behaviour, being very, very vague, changing his story, asking questions about the forensics of the case, and of course being very reluctant to give a DNA sample. On the 26th of October 2011, after both sides had presented all of their evidence, the jury was sent off to deliberate. And this actually went on for 2 days, 2 whole days they were deciding on their verdict. But thankfully on the 28th of October, they finally returned with a verdict of guilty. 33-year-old Vincent Tabak was found guilty of the murder of Joanna Yates Yates by a majority verdict of 10-2. So there were 2 jury members who seemed to believe his account, believing that it was an accident, but the majority did not. They believed that this was a cold-blooded murder. And at his sentencing, he received life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. And so, of course, prison is where he remains to this day. According to a couple of sources, after Vincent Tabak's trial, he was prosecuted for another crime unrelated to this one. He was charged with possessing indecent images of children, as it was discovered that he had several child pornography pictures stored on his laptop. So yeah, he was charged for that, and in March of 2015 he pleaded guilty and was given a further 10 months in prison. In the aftermath of this case, Christopher Jefferies, the man falsely accused of Joanna's murder, actually decided to sue a number of national newspapers for libel damages and defamation due to their treatment and harassment of him, due to the lies that they printed about him, just for how awfully they treated him during the time that he was a suspect in the case. As we discussed earlier, they would name him as a creep and a predator, someone who was really strange and would freak out schoolgirls. They completely destroyed him. They destroyed his reputation because in their eyes, in the media's eyes, he was guilty of this crime before he'd even been charged or convicted. And of course he wasn't. He wasn't guilty at all. And his lawsuit was successful. 8 newspapers in total made public apologies to Christopher Jefferies for their treatment of him. These newspapers were The Sun, The Sunday Mirror, The Daily Mirror, The Daily Record, The Daily Mail, The Daily Star, The Daily Press, and The Scotsman. And they were each ordered to pay a substantial amount to Christopher Jefferies in libel damages. I don't think it's known exactly how much this amount was, but according to one article, it was well over 6 figures. And in 2014, so 4 years after this case took place, an ITV drama was released about him. A 2-part series called The Lost Honour of Christopher Jefferies aired on ITV, all about how Christopher's life was turned completely upside down following Joanna's disappearance, and how he suffered at the hands of both the police and the British press. Actor Jason Watkins played Christopher Jefferies, and apparently Christopher did approve of the making of this drama, and he did read the script beforehand. And at the 2015 British Academy Television Awards, The Lost Honour of Christopher Jefferies actually won 2 separate awards. It won an award for Best Miniseries, and Jason Watkins himself won Best Actor for his portrayal. I haven't seen it myself. I didn't want to watch it before researching this case, but do let me know in the comments if you have seen it and if you think it is worth a watch. It was also in the aftermath of this case when a memorial garden for Joanna was set up by friends and former colleagues of hers at the Sir Harold Hillier Gardens and Arboretum, which is not far from her family home in Ampfield, Hampshire. The garden has a butterfly wing inspired wooden bench with trees and flowers, and it's a lovely tribute to Jo and her memory. And I have a quote here from Joanna's father, David Yates. He said of the memorial garden, "When we think of Jo, we think of her being in the garden, being outside. She was very happy and always saw the positive side to life. To have a memorial like this so close to home is very touching. It was very unexpected, but we really like it. We think of Jo all the time, but this is somewhere we will come and think of her too." My heart really goes out to Joanna's family, her parents. Watching their TV appeals from the days when Joanna was missing was just heartbreaking. I mean, you could see just how devastated they were and how special she was to them. But like I said, what a lovely tribute to her to have the memorial garden. And that is it for this case. That concludes the terrible case of Joanna Yates. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, as well as any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases, you name it. Again, just pop them in the comments down below, or alternatively you could go through my case request form, which is always linked in the description box of all of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!